Well, welcome to Conversations. My guest this evening is Brant Goode. It's his second time on the show. I asked him because he had gone to a conference out on the coast on adolescent sexuality. I know from experience that quite often you go to these conferences and you get motivated or you get new knowledge, and then you come back to town and nobody asks about it, or you don't get a chance to share. And so I wanted him to share some of the ideas that he got from this conference. Well, hi, Brant.
Hi, Greg. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, good.
I appreciate it.
Adolescent sexuality. What is an adolescent for the terms that we're talking about here?
Well, adolescence begins at puberty, and some would say it doesn't end until about 25.
In my case, it was much later. Okay.
Anyway, this was actually the 25th annual conference on adolescent sexuality. It's put on by one of the county health departments in Oregon. And they've been doing this for 25 years because they figured there was a significant need to help raise awareness among both professionals as well as communities about the things that adolescents are involved with when it comes to sexuality, often with a real problem focus.
Well, you paid yourself to go to this, right?
Yes, I wanted to go
because
really bad.
so what was it that really motivated you to want to go?
Well, part of the reason I wanted to go is I needed to get recharged. I also felt like I needed to get updated to see if there was anything really new going on in the big world of thinking about adolescent sexuality. And so here's this opportunity, and plus the Oregon coast. It's hard to pass up those two things.
And if there were one big thing that you came away with, could you pick one thing, one new revelation?
I don't know that it's new, but I think it certainly is something worth repeating. And that is the idea that if we want to help adolescents grow into healthy adults, then we need to respect them for who they are. We need to appreciate them, value them, both as either parents or friends or significant adults or as community members, anyone and everyone. The more there is a level of respect for these young people, the better I think the outcomes will be, regardless of the realm that we're talking about. Certainly specifically when it comes to adolescent sexuality issues, the more we respect their concerns, their developmental stages, their natural instincts, the more we talk openly with them about those things, the more likely I think we all are to benefit from having children, adolescents grow up into healthier adults.
I don't want to lead you away from the conference, but you and I have talked about this somewhat, that with the HIV stuff, if we're going to get people to work, we have to get their participation. And too often, people think that they can dictate to a group what they should be doing, or without realizing that the people you want to help should be involved as well and respected as equal partners in this process.
I would say perhaps unequal partners, they're more important.
Oh, yeah.
The approach you described is kind of the old school approach of telling people what to do, giving them the information they need, and expecting them, just because that's been done, for them to change or do things differently, maybe improve things. And it doesn't really work that well because it doesn't respect them again. Asking a group of teenagers what matters to them versus telling them that they shouldn't have sex, which is going to be more effective. If it wasn't, I guess, that long ago that I was that age, but if somebody had actually asked me and listened, I would have felt more respected and perhaps would have been more open to hearing from them information that might have helped me make choices, be better informed, those kinds of things.
I zoned out there for a minute. I'm trying to remember that far back. I don't think anybody talked to me.
I think the asking really helps, and certainly it's an honorable way of approaching work in public health, as well as I think many other types of things, types of endeavors, whether it be teaching. It can certainly go too far. You don't want to, I think, have curriculum dictated solely by students, but I think asking for input makes a good difference, and respecting that input.
Well, this is one thing that I find really disturbing, because having HIV, I find that people who want to help and who aren't HIV positive, there's this natural tendency, and I think it's so natural in everything, is that this us against them mentality develops in every field, whether it's teaching kids or talking to kids about sex or helping people with diseases or whatever, that somehow you draw these lines. It's us against them. And really, in all these areas, it would be so much more profitable if we could work with, people and respect them and say, how do we do these things together?
Right. And build upon strengths that are already there rather than focusing on problems. I think that, for example, the one that you raised, asking and honoring the input that we might get as public health or other types of workers, asking people with HIV, what would have helped in a situation in your past to keep you from doing some things that led to your infection? What would have helped? What could we try and do now to help other people who might be in those same kinds of situations?
I'm going to go back to that, but before we lose track of this conference,
Okay.
What were some of the other things that came up?
One of the most interesting points to me was a comparison and contrast between several European countries and America. A speaker named Barbara Huberman, who works for an organization called Advocates for Youth, presented data about the Netherlands, Germany, and France, and their very low rates of teen pregnancy, teen abortion, teen birth, and sexually transmitted infections. And Barbara was part of several tours, study tours, that went to these countries where people tried to figure out why or what was different about these countries compared or contrasted to America, and were there any lessons that could be brought home. And one of the main things, or the very first lesson, was what I mentioned first. These countries all do a very good job of honoring their young people. They treat them well, they expect them to succeed, they provide means for them to become self-sufficient as they grow older. They're treated with a great deal of respect and honor, and they're valued. Barbara Huberman talked about why that might be the situation there and why it's not here. And it seemed to be that it had a lot to do with World War II. It happened there. People were dying right and left in those countries. And so that the memory of that led, I think, to a legacy that people wanted to do a better job of appreciating their children because they'd been through such horrific times. And so that first generation after the war perhaps said, we really do need to do well by our children. They're our legacy. We need to do what we can to make sure that they succeed. And then the subsequent generations had that as a foundation to build upon, and now it's become the norm.
There might be another factor in that, and it's that so many people were killed there as opposed to the United States. The young people really were needed as part of the workforce and were forced to work earlier, harder, and therefore were, consequently treated with more respect and were treated as adults much sooner. I sometimes think that I think it's idiotic to assume that young people only become adults at 21 or
right.
some such thing.
She made several strong observations about these countries that were associated with their lower rates of these problems that I mentioned earlier. They have very pervasive campaigns to give young people information about sexuality, and it's not such a taboo there as much as it is here. Their curriculums in schools are not such a big deal to get into place because they've been in place for so long that the content is actually integrated throughout school curriculums. It's appropriate for different ages. They're certainly not trying to tell 10-year-olds to go out and have sex, but they are telling young people, perhaps 10 years of age, about their body parts with proper names. And they're showing young people condoms and telling them, when you're older, you can learn how to use these things. They're doing a good job of demystifying sex, and in place of the kind of lack of knowledge that seems to be very pervasive in America, they're giving them good information so that they can make good choices. And they're also putting in place an expectation that people behave responsibly, which is, I think, exactly what everybody would like to have happen, people being more careful, avoiding these problems. They just go about it in a way that I think people aren't as comfortable with here in the States.
Does this carry over into your own family? I know you have 2 daughters. Do you talk to them?
You bet, you bet. It was much easier when my girls were young, preschool age, to talk about these kinds of things like naming body parts. You know, this is your nose, these are your eyes, this is your mouth. For them, these are your breasts, pointing to genitals and saying, you know, this is where your clitoris is, or this is where your vagina is. And being open about doing that. Those, I think, are fairly easy kinds of things to talk about. As children grow older and things become more complex, it's become personally a bit more difficult to talk about these things. And I wish I had more models myself to follow. But that's the desire I have, is to be good about talking with them about these natural instincts that adolescents have, seeking pleasure, being able to feel pleasure and what that is about. I wish I had a better vocabulary, or I was more literate in my ability to talk about that. And I actually feel like I'm fairly good about it, but I also wish that I was even better at it than I am.
Well, that's an interesting point. You're saying that perhaps it's better to start early before it comes up, as opposed to waiting, you know, that once it gets to that age where it really is kind of dicey and you're not so sure you want to talk about it, that maybe it's better to start earlier.
You bet.
When it can be done in a less, I don't know what you would say, a less emotionally charged way. Let's put it this way. If you're just, this is what it is.
Right.
And
that was another of the findings in these 3 countries in Europe, is that they started earlier, giving information and talking about these things, as well as just doing it more openly, without so much taboo and fear associated with it. They were able to get through these things without as much difficulty as I think people face here.
I like that idea. You know, last time you and I talked, we talked about diseases having images and how you fight so hard to overcome some of those. And perhaps it might be better to start very early talking about AIDS and HIV and cancer and some of these ideas, so that these kids have a kind of neutral attitude towards these things, the kind of attitude that we work so hard to
Right. An informed
get
attitude.
to when they get older.
Right. I think not having information really hobbles people's decision-making ability. Giving them information early before they get into situations where they really need to make decisions based upon that information, that helps. That helps a lot. I lost my train of thought where I was going to go with it.
We'll edit it out.
Good. One of the other things that was noted in all of these countries in Europe was that there was very strong support throughout the culture, including government, to provide this kind of education and this kind of information, as well as access to services, regardless of ability to pay. They were not hobbled or restricted by religious impacts. It's not that they didn't listen, it's just that they said, this is public policy, this is citizenship, this is democratic principles in place here, not religious doctrine, that we are responsible for assuring. And it all comes back to health, trying to assure that people have the means with which to be healthy. They weren't telling people that the church was wrong, but they weren't letting church doctrine guide public policy.
And how do you avoid that?
That's a good question.
How do you avoid that here? That was what I was thinking about, is
Yeah.
when you have parents who are in a religious tradition where they don't want their children to know about that, or
Right. The issue here, I think, is not so much that religion is driving public policy or guiding public policy. It's that the vast majority of people who are concerned about these things, parents who are surveyed, more often than not, and it's very clear that they support comprehensive education around sexuality. And they would like it to be early. I think many people in America, many parents in America, would like to follow that model that was present in these other countries, to try to move beyond the massive stigma and taboo about talking about it. They don't have, I think, as many of the tools to vocalize those things as the very well-organized minority viewpoints do. It's kind of like the silent majority. They're not quite silent, it's just that they're not as well organized, and they're busy people, and they're facing a lot of other challenges in their own lives. It makes it more difficult to come up with consistent messages so that elected officials or people who hold public office or who work with schools feel safe, and that they're not going to be the recipient of a lot of vitriol from a minority.
You and I have been talking lately, exploring a number of ideas and new ways of thinking about prevention, because we are on this committee that is supposed to be doing that. I think too often both sides become politicized. I don't think, say, the fundamentalist parents, I mean, at some point they know their children are going to have sex. I don't think they want their children to catch sexual diseases any more than, say, liberal parents want their children to catch sexual diseases. I think, though, that sometimes this whole issue becomes charged on both sides with other issues.
Mm-hmm.
HIV becomes something that seems to advocate the acceptance of gay sexuality. And I think that sometimes we do that. I have seen that happen. And that if we're going to deal with these issues, perhaps we need to remove some of those things and just approach these things as, these are your children.
Yeah.
You know, you don't want them to be hurt. Let's find a way of educating them about these issues.
Right. I think you're right. It seems like there's either a polarization or extreme positioning, people not doing as good a job perhaps of listening, whichever side they may be on of any issue, versus I think a more important but perhaps harder concept of finding enough common ground and building on that. I think you're right. I don't think there's anybody out there that wants their children to grow up and get sick, to get hurt, to have problems associated with their sexuality, to have any kind of the negative consequences. There's a huge divide, though, in how we go about that. But still, even though there's that divide, there's the common goal. And I think that focusing on the common goal and then deciding, okay, how do we get there as a community? And that is our job, I think, on this committee, is to try and focus on the whole area's needs to do that and what can be done effectively. I'm not sure having grand public meetings where people can get up and talk about their positions and why they feel this way and why they're right and somebody else is wrong and vice versa is that useful. I think more useful is the focus on the actual problems of people getting sick, the characteristics of the people who are getting sick or getting hurt, and working, again, to find mutual ways or ways in common to deal with those things. It sounds idealistic, perhaps, to think that could happen. It sounds maybe even unrealistic, but I don't believe it's so. I think that there's plenty of common ground. For example, for people who are vehemently opposed to abortion, are they also going to be vehemently opposed to a pill that a young woman could take within 72 hours after an event that might lead to an unplanned pregnancy? Not a pill that causes abortion, like RU-486, but something that could be given that would actually prevent the pregnancy from ever occurring in the first place. It's not an abortion pill, which there is great debate about and lots of positioning on. This is very different. I think there could be common ground on that, and this is something that's newly available. It's often been referred to as a morning after pill, but there's new kinds coming out, and it can save a tremendous amount of trouble for people who access that. They might not have to face an actual abortion choice if they were able to access one of these emergency contraceptives within enough time after an event.
I think so often we demonize the other side. Maybe it's an American trait that we have two political parties, and therefore the rest of our lives and all of our social issues have to have only two sides. But and so if you're, shall we say, not pro-sex, but if you believe in a more open discussion of sex, then the people who don't are backward thinking, they're Hicks, they're fundamentalists, da-da-da-da. And by the same token, those folks think that, oh, those are liberal, homo-loving, da-da, you know. And I don't think that, I think that in the future it would be nice if we could get away from some of that.
Well, I agree. It would be nice.
I want to offer just a specific example. I'm not sure that I've told you about this, but that we have two people here in town that the AIDS Council used to send out to speak to schools. One was a gay man, the other one was a straight woman. And some school district off, I hesitate to say the hinterlands because that's sort of doing the thing that I'm saying we shouldn't do, but a more rural school district said, we don't want a gay man coming. Now, the young woman who had done all these presentations with her partner was really hurt. As a gay man, I got rather incensed, contacted the school district, threatened to write about them in Outspoken, da-da-da-da-da-da. And somehow I think all of us in that situation forgot that it was really about informing the kids. Perhaps we should have just dropped the gay guy and let the straight woman go. I don't know, but there was this battle that for gay rights and everything and pro and con gay that somehow got into this discussion and
it's become very fiery. People have had threats made against them for talking openly about sex in general, no matter what the location, even in Missoula. The divisiveness is not helpful. In that kind of situation, I'm glad that the young woman was able to go and talk. I think that was at least better than no one going to an area and talking. There's certainly places within Missoula, you know, our liberal community, where I think that kind of presentation by a gay man probably took some persuasion on whether it was a school environment or another group, took persuasion of the people who were in charge of the setting to allow that or to feel more comfortable with it. Lots of justifications, I think, on the anger of people or the hurt of being restricted that way. It's homophobic. One of the lessons again.
Health. And we sort of inject these other issues into questions that really should be about public health.
Right, and getting away from that. I guess at least a baby step was taken, and hopefully more baby steps can be taken, and hopefully some bigger steps too. But people don't always change easily, communities certainly don't. But I do believe that those places can change, and I know that there's a lot of valiant work going on But homophobia is still a very real thing in areas, and sometimes it does lead to threats of violence. And even in Missoula, that's happened.
You and I have also talked, we both are church goers, and I, as a gay person, keep preaching that the churches have a place in making the society more tolerant. But you and I have been talking about actually using the churches as a place for HIV prevention, and that perhaps we could work with churches, go to them and say, you have young people there, how could this be done? And that, I think, would short-circuit this whole problem of whether the schools can teach these things. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it's an idea. I think that perhaps we should be thinking about new ways of doing some of these
Right. I think it's, we heard advice from other people that both the churches and the schools are places where people go and learn what are called the greater goods, the highly valued things in society that are good. Not all religious organizations are as restrictive or repressive in their church doctrine about sexuality. There's a lot of interpretation depending on location, even within the same church. There's a lot to be said, I think, also for expanding notions of sexuality to include things that might be sacred or spiritual, and just expanding that vocabulary, even if it doesn't specifically address HIV or homosexuality, I think can help just create a richer community definition around sexuality.
I'm starting to feel more and more that really kids are where it's at. That you reach a certain point and it becomes almost impossible to teach certain things. As liberal as I like to think of myself, I have certain racial feelings, for instance, that are there on such a deep emotional level that they make it hard for me to relate to people of certain races. And I'm not going to get into that, but I'm just saying that they're there and I fight them and I don't like having them. And I think that, if you can start younger with these kids, those things can disappear and never become an issue. And that when we think so much that we have to that all these problems are too adult for children to handle. And actually it's perhaps just the opposite, is that by the time you get to an adult, those patterns are set.
Right.
And
that's a great argument for strong, consistent, research-based, effective education in schools. That was one of the other points that Barbara Huberman made about these countries in Europe, is that their teaching was based on what research shows. It wasn't on church doctrine, certainly it wasn't on political persuasion, it was based on research. It was based on hard science, and I think that's a great thing to try and do. I like your point, and I want to talk about a public health concept and turn it on its head to see if it fits. In public health, we talk about morbidity and mortality and life expectancy, and one of the more useful terms is years of productive life lost. And what that refers to is there's an average life expectancy. And if a person dies at that point, then they've lived a, quote, productive life, unquote. If they die 10 years before that point, well, they've lost 10 years of productive life. Or the community or society has lost that. If you take it to the situation where a child dies, a whole lot more of a person's productive life capacity has been lost. In the case of HIV and AIDS, because so many people have died from AIDS at young ages, a whole lot of the impact of the epidemic is in the years of productive life that were never accomplished by these people. All the things that they didn't get to do. within our society. Let me turn that on its head and talk about years of productive life gained. You talked about how maybe adults are too old to teach some of these things, or maybe it's too hard to change adults. And even if you could, you'd only be gaining that much of productive life. But if you could work with children, younger people, and help them to become healthier at an earlier age, then you've gained more productive life capacity. What do you think?
I'm not sure I'm getting what you're saying. Run it by me again.
Okay, well, there's a fairly standard term in public health called years of productive life lost,
Right.
which is the younger you are, the worse it is. What I'm saying is if you could do good things, the younger a person is, the better and longer the impact. And so there's a lot of logic in working with young people.
I see that. Yeah.
Okay. I like the idea of working with younger people and setting good foundations so that they can build on them versus trying to help somebody who is 25, 35, 45, 55 versus 5 or 10. There's more to be gained with younger people.
That's certainly true. I don't know if I've told you this story, but when Kennedy was elected president, my grandmother just went into a fit because he was a Catholic. And then she said, well, the next thing you know, they'll have a black president. And she didn't use the word black. And somewhere along there, I had been educated that both those attitudes against people's religion and against their color were wrong. And I'm sure I picked those up somewhere in school or in church or somewhere. And
well, or TV
I
with
don't
Martin
know,
Luther King.
or
Yeah.
somewhere, but those attitudes, I'd already learned them in '63, so, really, I more and more think that we really have got to get to the kids on all of these issues.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings me to something else, which is being gay and having this show, which is to get some of these ideas out there, is that one of the things that holds gay people back is that we feel that somehow we shouldn't be talking about these issues.
Talking about children? Or
About
children's
children,
issues?
right. That,
Why not?
hovering over homosexuality is this sort of specter of child molestation.
Mm-hmm.
Even the statistics that say, it's heterosexuals who are most likely to molest children, there's that old stereotype, and there's a lot of fear. And so somehow...
And heterosexual people don't.
Right, and that for some reason, somehow if you're gay, you shouldn't be talking about kids. And
Well, I think homosexuals have as much right to talk about kids as anyone else. And I would also say unequivocally that everybody has a responsibility towards kids, whether they're parents or not, whether they're gay or straight or not. It's just they're part of our community, and they're the most vulnerable part in many ways. And how well we all take care of kids has more to do with how well off they will be in the future and how well we will actually be taken care of in our futures by them.
one time in San Francisco, I was sunbathing out in the park, and there were some young guys who were over on the sidewalk. Mm-hmm. And they were calling every woman that went by a word which I'm not going to use here. And they were calling every guy that went by a faggot. And they were just making life very difficult for anyone who went along that sidewalk.
How old were these people?
Oh, they were early teens.
Okay.
12, 13, 14, I don't know. And I in kind of a fit of anger, I thought to myself, who do these kids belong to? And that has haunted me ever since, is who do those kids belong to? Mm-hmm. Is it the parents? Is it society at large? You get parents who claim that, these are my kids, they'll do what I want. And I think to some extent the parents have a responsibility, but also these kids are going to be members of society at large. And I think those of us who pay taxes, who help create the institutions in which these children are going to work and function as adults, that we have some say in there as well, whether we're gay or straight, married or single, childless, or, having 10 or 15 children, that we really are all in this boat together. And
I think you're absolutely right.
And I think gay people, and there's also the point is that a lot of gay people have children and more all the time.
Right. As a parent, I guess it's kind of a fantasy that you could actually do it all and create the perfect environment and have your children grow up perfect. But it's not that kind of world. We're not that kind of beings. We're social creatures, yet we're still animal type of creatures with instincts. We have institutions like churches or schools or marriage or any number of other things to help us deal with all of this situation. But I think it's short-sighted at a minimum to think that two parents could do everything for their child that the child needed. And so we do depend on other people as parents to help. I certainly know that I've been very appreciative of things like good child care. My wife and I both had to work when we had young children. And having good child care, and this is really going off on a tangent, but I'll try and bring it back to what we were talking about. Our standard for good child care was somebody who would do it as well as we could if we were home. High standards, there's nothing wrong with that. The person we found was a lesbian. She did a beautiful job. She was my youngest daughter's mother away from home. And I still think of her like that. I still thank her for her love and nurturing and the help that she has given to our whole family by helping my daughter grow up in a better way. She was a great person. And I mentioned that she was a lesbian. That had nothing really to do with it. It had more to do with how well she took care of our daughter.
Brant, I want to thank you for coming today. You got back, just this morning?
Right.
And I know you had a busy day at the health department on top of just the normal things that you missed. And so I really appreciate your coming and sharing with us.
Thanks, Greg.
Bye.